The morning of December 19th, 1944, near the Belgian town of Streetvith. Through the morning fog, a German tank commander named Oberleutnant Friedrich Baer scans the tree line 2,000 yards ahead. His King Tiger, all 68 tons of it, idles in formation with 5 others. The exhaust plumes rise into the frozen air. Inside the turret, the air smells of oil, sweat, and the metallic tang of cordite from earlier engagements. Baer isn't worried. He shouldn't be. The King Tiger is the most heavily armoured tank in the world. Its frontal glacis plate measures 7 inches thick, sloped at 50 degrees. American tank destroyers carry 76mm guns, weapons that have been bouncing off Tiger armour since Normandy. At this range, nearly 3,000 yards, Baer knows he's effectively invulnerable. The Americans would need to close to within 800 yards to have any chance of penetration, and by then, his own 88mm gun would have already turned them into burning wrecks. He orders the column forward. They're part of Kampfgruppe Paper, the spearhead of the Ardennes offensive. Their mission is simple: break through American lines, seize the fuel depots at Stavelot, and drive for the Meuse River. Speed matters more than caution. The Americans are disorganized, retreating. This is the moment Germany has been waiting for since June, the chance to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace. From the tree line, 2,700 yards away, Staff Sergeant Robert Early watches through his periscope. His vehicle, designated TD-7, doesn't look particularly different from the M10 Wolverines the Germans have been facing for months. Same angular hull, same open-topped turret, but the gun barrel protruding from that turret is not the 76mm the Germans expect. It's a 90mm M3 gun, and the Germans have no idea it exists. Early's gunner, Corporal James Hensley, tracks the lead King Tiger through his sight. The rangefinder reads 2,700 yards. In a 76mm equipped destroyer, this shot would be impossible. The shell would barely reach, let alone penetrate. But the 90mm is different. At this range, its armor-piercing round still carries enough kinetic energy to punch through 7.5 inches of steel. Target, tank, 2,700 yards, Early says quietly into the intercom. Identified, Hensley responds. Fire. The M36 Jackson rocks backward as the 90mm gun roars. The 24-pound projectile leaves the barrel at 2,800 feet per second, faster than sound, faster than the German 88. It crosses nearly half a mile in just over 3 seconds. Inside King Tiger number 331, Baer has no warning. The armor-piercing round strikes his turret at a shallow angle, exactly where the curved front plate meets the turret ring. The shell penetrates. The interior of the tank becomes, for a fraction of a second, hell itself. The kinetic energy transfers into heat and fragmentation. Ammunition ignites. The turret blows 15 feet into the air. Baer and his crew die before they understand what killed them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Hensley's voice crackles over the intercom. Hit. Target destroyed. Early is already scanning for the next target. The German column has stopped moving. They're confused. They've been hit from beyond what they thought was effective range. They can barely see the muzzle flash through the fog and forest. Their doctrine, their training, their experience, all of it says they're safe at this distance. But they're not. And they're about to learn just how wrong their assumptions have been. This is the story of the M36 Jackson, a weapon that changed the battlefield, the calculus of the final months of World War II, and did so largely because the Germans never realized what they were facing until it was far too late. It's a story about intelligence failures, battlefield adaptation, and the strange advantage of looking ordinary while being extraordinary. But more than that, it's a story about how wars are won not just by superior weapons, but by keeping those weapons secret long enough to exploit them. To understand why the M36's 90mm gun was so devastating, and why the Germans failed to identify it for nearly 3 critical months, we need to go back to the summer of 1944 to Normandy, where American tank crews were learning a painful lesson about German armour. The problem emerged within days of D-Day. American tankers had trained to fight Panzer III's and Panzer IV's medium tanks with frontal armour between 1.5 to 3 inches thick. The 75mm gun on the M4 Sherman could handle those threats at reasonable combat ranges. But Normandy introduced American crews to something they hadn't adequately prepared for: the Panther and the Tiger. The Panther OSF G, Germany's most effective medium tank, mounted 80mm of frontal armour at a 55-degree slope, effectively doubling its resistance to penetration. The Tiger I carried 100mm of vertical armour, and in June of 1944, the Germans deployed their newest monster, the Tiger II, known to Allied soldiers as the King Tiger or Royal Tiger. The King Tiger represented the apex of German heavy tank design. It weighed 68 tons. Its frontal armor measured 180 millimeters, 7 inches of case-hardened steel, sloped to deflect incoming rounds. Its 88mm KK 43 liters, 71 gun could penetrate the frontal armor of any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. In terms of raw armor protection and firepower, nothing the Western Allies fielded could match it in direct combat. American tank destroyer doctrine had been built around speed and ambush tactics. The M10 Wolverine, introduced in 1942, carried a 3-inch 76mm gun. It was adequate against earlier German armor, but against a Panther at combat ranges beyond 1,000 yards, the M10's gun struggled. Against a King Tiger, it was effectively useless unless it could maneuver for a side or rear shot. The M18 Hellcat, introduced in mid-1944, was faster, capable of 55 miles per hour on roads, but it carried the same 76mm gun. Speed could help it survive, but it couldn't solve the fundamental problem. American tank destroyers lacked the penetrating power to reliably kill German heavy armor at the ranges where combat typically occurred. First, Army Ordnance officers in Normandy filed urgent reports throughout July and August. The 76mm gun, they noted, achieved penetration against Panther frontal armor only at ranges below 500 yards, well within the Panther's own lethal range. Against King Tigers, which began appearing in small numbers near Caen in late July, the reports were bleak. One after-action summary from the 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion stated simply, 76mm AP ineffective against Tiger II frontal armor at any practical engagement range. The psychological effect on crews was measurable. Tank destroyer battalions reported increased instances of crews abandoning vehicles at the sight of King Tigers, even at ranges where the German tanks hadn't fired. The weight of invulnerability of facing an enemy you couldn't hurt, but who could destroy you with ease, created a tactical paralysis that transcended pure military calculation. But the solution to this problem was already being manufactured in the United States. It just hadn't arrived in theaters yet. The 90mm gun wasn't new technology. It had been developed in the late 1930s as an anti-aircraft weapon, a replacement for the aging 3-inch AA gun. By 1940, the 90mm M1 and M2 anti-aircraft guns were in widespread production. Thousands were deployed to defend American cities, ports, and military installations against potential air attack. These guns were powerful. A 90mm anti-aircraft shell weighed 24 pounds and left the barrel at 2,800 feet per second. That velocity was necessary to hit fast-moving aircraft at high altitude, but someone in Army Ordnance, the specific individual's name has been lost to history, recognized that the same ballistic characteristics that made the 90mm effective against aircraft would make it devastating against tanks. The challenge was mounting it on a mobile chassis. Early experiments in 1943 involved mounting the 90mm gun on various tank hulls. The weapon was heavy, the gun itself weighed nearly 2 tons, and the entire mount assembly weighed considerably more. It required a large turret ring and a chassis capable of handling the recoil forces. Simply bolting it onto an existing tank destroyer design wouldn't work. The structural stress would crack the hull. The solution came from the M10A1 hull, itself a modification of the M4 Sherman tank chassis. Engineers designed a new, larger turret, the T-72, specifically to house the 90mm gun. The turret was open-topped, a design choice that saved weight but left the crew vulnerable to artillery airburst and overhead attack. The trade-off was considered acceptable. Tank destroyers weren't meant to hold ground. They were meant to kill tanks and displace before the enemy could respond. By March of 1944, the first pilot vehicles were undergoing trials at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. The results were extraordinary. At 1,000 yards, the 90mm M3 gun firing standard, armor-piercing ammunition could penetrate 7.6 inches of homogeneous steel plate. At 2,000 yards, penetration dropped to 6.1 inch, still sufficient to defeat the King Tiger's frontal armor at steep angles. But here's what made the M36 genuinely revolutionary. It didn't look revolutionary. From a distance, the distance at which tank combat typically occurred, the M36 appeared nearly identical to the M10 Wolverine. Both vehicles used similar hulls. Both had open-topped turrets. The primary visual difference was the gun barrel. The M36's 90mm gun was slightly longer and fractionally thicker than the M10's 76mm. But through a periscope at 1,000 yards, or through the haze and smoke of a battlefield at 2,000 yards, that difference was effectively invisible. This similarity was not accidental. Using the M10 chassis for the M36 simplified logistics and production, but it also created an unintended intelligence advantage. The Germans would not immediately recognize the M36 as a new weapon system. To German reconnaissance and frontline troops, it would appear to be just another M10, a vehicle they'd been successfully engaging for months. Production began in earnest in April of 1944. The Fisher Tank Division of General Motors built the M36 at their Detroit facilities, alongside Sherman tanks and other armored vehicles. By September, production had reached full scale. 2,324 M36 Jacksons would eventually be built, a substantial number, but far fewer than the M10, 6,406 produced, or the M18 Hellcat, 2,507 produced. The first M36s shipped to Europe in late September of 1944. They arrived without fanfare, assigned to tank destroyer battalions that had been operating M10s and M18s since the Normandy breakout. Crews received minimal additional training, the vehicles handled similarly to their predecessors, and the gun, while more powerful, operated on the same principles. But with the vehicles came specific instructions. A classified memo from 1st Army Ordnance, dated October 3, 1944, included this paragraph. Units equipped with the M36 90mm GMC are directed to engage enemy heavy armor at maximum effective range whenever tactically feasible. Crews are advised that the M36's profile closely resembles that of the M10 Wolverine. Enemy forces are not currently aware of the 90mm gun's deployment. Exploitation of this intelligence advantage is considered operationally critical. Enemy identification of the weapon's capabilities should be delayed as long as possible through appropriate tactical employment. In simpler terms, hit them from far away, and don't let them figure out what you're using. The first combat deployment of the M36 occurred in the third week of October, 1944, in the forests east of Aachen. The 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion, which had been fighting across France since June with M10 Wolverines, received 12 M36 Jacksons as replacements for vehicles lost during the Siegfried Line battles. Staff Sergeant Robert Early, who'd been commanding an M10 since Normandy, was among the first to receive an M36. In a post-war interview conducted as part of the Army's historical documentation project, Early described his reaction. "They told us it had a 90mm. I thought they were joking. We'd been fighting with 76s since June. You get used to knowing your maximum effective range about 1,200 yards against a Panther, maybe 800 if you wanted to be sure. Anything beyond that, you're throwing dice. Now they're telling me I can kill a tiger at 2,500 yards? It seemed impossible." The 702nd's first engagement with the M36 occurred on October 23 during a German counterattack near Verlautenheide. Early's crew spotted a Panther OSF G advancing across open ground at approximately 2,400 yards, a range at which the M10's 76mm gun would have been marginally effective at best. Early ordered his gunner, Corporal Hensley, to engage. Hensley later recalled, "I ranged it at 2,400 yards. In the M10, I wouldn't have bothered shooting, waste of ammunition. But Early said fire, so I put the crosshair on the turret and squeezed. The round struck the Panther's turret front, penetrated, and detonated the ammunition stored inside. The Panther exploded. Hensley's immediate response, recorded in the battalion's war diary, 'Did we just do that?' Over the following 2 weeks, M36s in the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion destroyed 9 German tanks, a mix of Panthers and Panzer IVs at ranges between 1,800 and 2,600 yards. German after-action reports from the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, recovered after the war from German military archives, mention these engagements, but they describe them as artillery strikes or anti-tank gunfire, not mobile tank destroyer engagements. The pattern was repeating. German intelligence was interpreting long-range, high-velocity hits as coming from emplaced guns or field artillery, not from vehicles. The idea that an American tank destroyer could kill a Panther at 2,500 yards didn't fit their understanding of American capabilities, so the reports were being filed under different threat categories. This wasn't stupidity. It was the natural result of intelligence analysis based on established patterns. German military intelligence, the Fremde Heere West, or Foreign Armies West, had spent years cataloguing Allied equipment. They knew about the M4 Sherman's 75mm gun. They knew about the M10's 76mm. They'd seen the M18 Hellcat, which also carried a 76mm. Their assessment was clear. American mobile anti-tank weapons maxed out at 76mm. Anything more powerful was either towed artillery or emplaced anti-tank guns. So when reports came in of vehicles being destroyed at long range by high-velocity fire, German analysts fit the data to their existing model. It had to be something other than a tank destroyer. The alternative, that the Americans had deployed a completely new weapon system without German intelligence detecting it, seemed less likely than misidentification of the source of fire. This cognitive bias, fitting new data to existing models rather than questioning the models themselves, would cost German armor dearly in the months ahead. By early November, 47 M36 Jacksons were operating with 1st Army units along the German border. They were distributed among 4 tank destroyer battalions, the 702nd, 654th, 703rd, and 801st. Their kill rates were markedly higher than those of M10 or M18 units operating in the same sectors. Between October 23rd and November 15th, M36 equipped units reported 53 confirmed tank kills. German losses in the same sectors, cross-referenced with Wehrmacht loss reports, confirm 41 destroyed tanks, a reasonable correlation given the chaos of battlefield reporting. Of those 41 confirmed German losses, 33 were Panthers, 6 were Panzer IVs, and 2 were Tiger Is. No King Tigers were engaged during this period. The Tiger II was still relatively rare. Germany produced only 492 King Tigers total, compared to 6,000 Panthers produced in the same time frame. Most King Tigers were concentrated with heavy tank battalions held in reserve for critical sectors. But that was about to change. On November 8, 1944, near the French city of Metz, a King Tiger from Schwerpanzerabteilung 506, the 506th Heavy Tank Battalion, was disabled by what its crew reported as high-velocity artillery fire, possibly 105mm. The King Tiger, vehicle number 223, had been advancing in support of infantry clearing American positions from a fortified ridgeline. At approximately 1400 hours, it was struck in the turret by a round that penetrated the side armor, detonated internally, and killed 2 crew members. The remaining crew bailed out. The tank burned. German combat engineers examined the wreck the following day, after American forces withdrew from the sector. Their report, preserved in the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg, describes a penetration consistent with heavy artillery, estimated caliber 100 to 120mm, fired from an elevated position approximately 2,000 meters distant. The actual source of fire had been an M36 from the 654th Tank Destroyer Battalion, positioned on a hillside 2,300 yards away. But the German report makes no mention of a tank destroyer. The assumption heavy artillery was recorded as fact. This was the first King Tiger, destroyed by an M36. It would not be the last. The failure to correctly identify the weapon that killed Vehicle 223 was not an isolated incident. It was part of a broader pattern of German intelligence failures during the autumn of 1944, failures driven not by incompetence, but by the overwhelming volume of data German analysts were trying to process and the cognitive frameworks they used to interpret it. By November, the German army was fighting on 3 fronts: against the Soviets in the east, against the Western Allies in France and the Low Countries, and against partisan forces in occupied territories. Intelligence resources were stretched. Reports from hundreds of units flooded headquarters daily. Analysts prioritized immediate tactical threats, troop movements, airfield locations, supply routes over detailed technical assessments of enemy equipment. More critically, German intelligence doctrine relied heavily on visual identification. Reconnaissance. Aircraft photographed Allied vehicle parks and assembly areas. Forward observers sketched vehicles they encountered. These visual reports were compared against a master catalogue of identified Allied equipment. The M36, which looked nearly identical to the M10 from any distance beyond 500 yards, was being consistently misidentified as the older, less capable vehicle. On November 14th, German intelligence issued an updated assessment of American tank destroyer capabilities. The document, titled Panzerabwehrwaffen der US Army Anti-Tank Weapons of the US Army, listed 3 mobile tank destroyers: the M10 with a 76mm gun, the M18 with a 76mm gun, and the M36 with a 76mm gun. The M36 was in the report, but the gun caliber was wrong. How did this happen? The answer lies in a photograph taken by a Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft on November 9th, near the Belgian town of Eupen. The photo showed 4 American tank destroyers in a motor park. German photo interpreters identified them as M10 Wolverines based on their profile. One interpreter noted in the margin, possible M36 variant turret appears slightly larger. This notation was technically correct, but when the information was compiled into the intelligence summary, the distinction was lost. The M36 was listed, but because it looked like an M10, analysts assumed it carried the same gun. This error would propagate through German intelligence reports for the next 5 weeks, right up to the beginning of the Ardennes offensive. But while German intelligence struggled to identify the M36, German tank crews in the field were beginning to notice something was wrong. They couldn't identify the specific weapon killing them, but they could see the effects. Vehicles destroyed at ranges previously considered safe, penetrations achieved from angles that shouldn't have been possible with 76mm guns. On November 22nd, during the Battle of Geilenkirchen, the 9th Panzer Division lost 3 Panthers and 1 King Tiger in less than 15 minutes, to what the unit's war diary describes as American tank destroyers, type unknown, engaging from approximately 2,500 meters. The battalion commander, Hauptmann Werner Rahn, filed an urgent report. American TD forces now demonstrate capability to achieve lethal hits against all armor types at extreme range. Recommend immediate revision of engagement doctrine. Current practice of closing range to force TD withdrawal is no longer viable. Suggest standoff engagement beyond 3,000 meters until technical assessment of American weapons completed. Rahn's report was forwarded up the chain of command. It reached LXVI Army Corps headquarters on November 24th. An ordnance officer reviewed it and appended a memo. Assessment: American forces likely employing improved 76mm ammunition, possibly tungsten core APCR rounds, captured from British stocks. Alternative hypothesis: increased deployment of towed 3-inch anti-tank guns in forward positions. No evidence of new mobile weapons systems. Recommend increased caution but no doctrinal revision pending further intelligence. The ordnance officer's conclusion was wrong, but it was logical given the information available. The British did use tungsten core APCR armor-piercing composite rigid ammunition for their 17-pounder guns, and some American units had received 17-pounder equipped British vehicles. The idea that Americans had developed better ammunition for existing guns seemed more plausible than the alternative, that they'd deployed an entirely new vehicle without German intelligence detecting it. Rahn's recommendation, engage at ranges beyond 3,000 meters, was forwarded to panzer units as advisory guidance. But 3,000 meters was beyond the effective range of the German 88mm gun against moving targets. In practice, the guidance couldn't be implemented without sacrificing offensive capability. So German tank crews continued to operate under the assumption that they were relatively safe at ranges beyond 1,500 yards. This assumption would prove catastrophic in the Ardennes. But before we get to the bulge, there's one more incident that deserves attention because it represents the closest the Germans came to discovering the truth about the M36 before it was too late. On December 2nd, 1944, an M36 from the 654th Tank Destroyer Battalion struck a mine near the German town of Saarlautern. The vehicle's tracks were destroyed, and the crew was forced to abandon it under artillery fire. They were unable to destroy the vehicle before retreating. German forces captured the M36 intact. The vehicle was photographed extensively. Engineers measured the gun barrel diameter, 90mm. They examined the ammunition storage, 90mm rounds, clearly marked. They measured penetration holes in German tank wrecks found nearby, consistent with 90mm impacts. The evidence was overwhelming and unambiguous. The Americans had deployed a 90mm armed tank destroyer. The photographs and measurements were compiled into a report by a technical intelligence team from Waffenamt, the German Army's weapons procurement office. The report was dated December 4th and included detailed technical drawings of the M36's gun mount and turret assembly. But then the report disappeared into the German military bureaucracy. It was sent to Berlin for comprehensive technical assessment. That assessment was assigned to a specific department within Waffenamt responsible for evaluating enemy weapons. Under normal circumstances, this assessment would take 3 to 5 days, after which a summary would be distributed to field commanders. But these were not normal circumstances. Berlin, in December of 1944, was chaos. The city was under constant air attack. Government ministries were relocating to bunkers and dispersed facilities. The Waffenamt office that received the M36 report was in the process of evacuating to Thuringia. The report was packed into a crate with hundreds of other documents and shipped east. It would not be analysed until January. By the time German intelligence officially confirmed the existence of the M36's 90mm gun and distributed warnings to field units, the Battle of the Bulge would be over, and hundreds of German tanks would have been destroyed by a weapon their crews didn't know existed. December 16th, 1944, 0530 hours. Along an 85-mile front in the Ardennes forest, 2,000 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The bombardment lasted 90 minutes. Then, out of the pre-dawn darkness and fog, came the tanks. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, was Adolf Hitler's final gamble in Rhine, the West. The plan was audacious. Smash through the weakly held American lines in the Ardennes, drive northwest to Antwerp, split the British and American armies, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. It was desperate. It was almost certainly doomed to fail. But for Hitler, it represented the only hope of avoiding total defeat. The Germans committed 3 armies to the offensive: the 6th SS Panzer Army in the north, 5th Panzer Army in the center, and 7th Army in the south. The armored spearheads included nearly 600 tanks and assault guns, among them the most powerful vehicles Germany could field: Panthers, Tiger Is, and the dreaded King Tigers. The King Tiger battalions Schwerpanzerabteilung 501 and 506 were at full strength for one of the few times in the war. Each battalion fielded 45 King Tigers. These were the elite units, the tip of the spear, the battering rams meant to break open the American defenses and create the breakthrough corridor, and their commanders believed they were facing an enemy whose most powerful mobile anti-tank weapon was the 76mm gun. The initial American units hit by the offensive were catastrophically unprepared. The 106th Infantry Division, newly arrived in theatre, was overrun within 48 hours. 2 entire regiments, more than 8,000 men, were surrounded and forced to surrender. German spearheads penetrated 20 miles into American lines in some sectors, but in the town of Street Vith, a critical road junction, American forces held. Among the defenders were elements of the 7th Armored Division, including the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with M36 Jacksons. This is where Oberleutnant Friedrich Behr's King Tigers encountered Staff Sergeant Robert Early's 90mm gun. The engagement began at 08:15 on December 19th. Behr's company, 6 King Tigers, was advancing in column formation along a ridgeline east of Street Vith. Their mission was straightforward: break through the American defensive line, secure the crossroads, and continue west. Speed was essential. Fuel was already a concern. German logistics had failed to capture American fuel dumps as planned, and the offensive was running on fumes. Behr wasn't worried about American tank destroyers. His intelligence briefing had been clear: M10S and M18S, both with 76mm guns, effective only at close range. At the distances, his column was operating 2,000 to 3,000 yards from the nearest suspected American positions. He considered his vehicles essentially immune. This assumption was based on months of German combat experience. Since Normandy, American tank destroyers had proven dangerous only when they could close to within 800 to 1,000 yards. At longer ranges, they were ineffective. German doctrine had adapted. When faced with American TDs, advance aggressively to force them to displace or die. But the 4 M36s positioned in the tree line west of Street Vith were not following that script. Staff Sergeant Early had established his position before dawn. His crew had dug the M36 into a shallow hull-down position, using the natural terrain to conceal everything but the turret. The other 3 M36s in his platoon were similarly positioned, spaced 200 yards apart along the ridge. When Behr's column appeared through the morning fog, Early's gunner ranged them immediately, 2,700 yards. In an M10, this would have been an impossible shot. In the M36, it was well within effective range. Early didn't hesitate. His orders from the battalion had been explicit: engage heavy armor at maximum range. Don't let them close. Target, lead tank, 2,700 yards. Hensley acquired the target through his telescopic sight. The King Tiger was moving slowly, perhaps 15 miles per hour, following the road. The range was long, but the target was large and the angle was good, slightly oblique, exposing the turret side. Identified. Fire. The 90mm gun roared. The M36's suspension rocked backward, absorbing the recoil. The shell crossed half a mile in 3.2 seconds. Inside King Tiger 331, Behr was scanning the opposite tree line when the world ended. The armor-piercing round struck the turret just forward of the commander's cupola. At that range and angle, the shell retained enough kinetic energy to penetrate the 100mm side armor. It entered the crew compartment, shattered, and transformed into dozens of white-hot fragments traveling at thousands of feet per second. The loader died instantly, his body shredded by spalling. The gunner survived for perhaps 2 seconds before the ammunition stored beside him ignited. The resulting explosion blew the turret completely off the hull, lifting it 15 feet into the air before it crashed down 30 yards away. Bear and his driver had no time to react. The explosion consumed them. In the M36, Hensley reported calmly, "Hit, target destroyed." The German column stopped. This was wrong. They were too far away for American guns to be effective. The logical explanation artillery didn't fit the trajectory. The hit had been too flat, too direct. But if not artillery, then what? The second King Tiger commander, Oberfeldwebel Klaus Dietrich, made the decision to advance. If they were facing anti-tank guns, towed weapons, or tank destroyers, the correct response was to close the range and use the King Tiger's superior firepower to suppress them. He ordered his tank forward at full speed. This was exactly what German doctrine prescribed. It was also exactly the wrong move. Early had already shifted targets. His loader had rammed another round into the breach. The gun was ready. Target, second tank, advancing, 2,500 yards. Identified. Fire. The second shot struck King Tiger, 337 in the frontal glacis. At 2,500 yards, the angle was poor. The slope of the armor deflected much of the shell's energy. But the M36's 90mm gun, at that range, still delivered sufficient force. The shell penetrated, drove through the forward compartment, killed the driver and bow gunner, and lodged in the engine bay without detonating. The tank coasted to a halt, engine dead, crew abandoning. Now the German formation was in chaos. They were under fire from an unseen enemy at a range where they should have been invulnerable. 2 tanks destroyed or disabled in less than 30 seconds. The remaining 4 King Tigers spread out, trying to locate the source of fire. The M36S fired again. 3 rounds, nearly simultaneously, from 3 different positions along the ridge. One missed the shell impacted short, throwing up a geyser of frozen dirt. 2 hits. King Tiger 342 took a round through the turret side. King Tiger 347. The company command tank was struck in the engine deck. Both vehicles burned. In less than 2 minutes, Bear's company had lost 4 out of 6 tanks. The survivors were pulling back, retreating behind the ridgeline they'd just crossed. German infantry, who'd been following the tanks, went to ground. The advance had stopped. From German radio intercepts recorded by American Signals Intelligence, we have fragments of the confusion. Penetrations at extreme range. Cannot identify weapon type. Request artillery on grid 294, multiple AT guns. Caliber unknown. Tiger Company reports 50% losses, withdrawing to. The German battalion commander, Major Hans von Luck, attempted to reorganize the attack. He brought up additional armor, 3 more King Tigers and 5 Panthers, and ordered a coordinated assault with infantry and artillery support. But he made a critical error. He assumed he was facing towed anti-tank guns, not mobile tank destroyers. Towed guns couldn't move quickly. Once they fired, they revealed their positions. The German counter-battery doctrine was to suppress them with artillery, then advance under smoke. But the M36S weren't towed guns. As soon as the German artillery began falling on their previous positions, they displaced backing out of their hull-down positions, moving 200 yards, establishing new firing positions. By the time the German attack resumed, the M36S were firing from different locations. The second wave of German armor advanced at 1300 hours. 9 tanks, 3 King Tigers, 6 Panthers moving in a broad line with infantry support. Smoke obscured the tree line. German artillery was still falling on the original M36 positions. The M36S opened fire at 2,200 yards. 3 Panthers died in the first volley. The King Tigers, in the center of the formation, returned fire. But they were shooting at muzzle flashes through smoke and haze, at targets they could barely see. Their accuracy was poor. The M36S continued firing, methodical, disciplined. At this range, the 90mm gun was supremely effective. Each round that connected meant a kill or a mission kill. The German advance faltered, then stopped, then reversed. By 1400 hours, the Germans had withdrawn. They left 11 tanks burning in the fields east of Street 5th. German infantry, without armor support, pulled back to defensive positions. The breakthrough at Street 5th had failed. In his post-battle report, Major von Luck wrote, "American defensive positions equipped with heavy anti-tank weapons, estimated caliber 100 to 120 millimeters, multiple positions, high rate of fire, extreme accuracy at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, unable to close with enemy positions due to prohibitive losses. Recommend bypass of Street 5th salient, seek alternate route west." He still didn't understand what had killed his tanks. This pattern repeated across the Ardennes front over the following week. German armour, advancing with confidence born from months of experience fighting 76mm guns, encountered M36s and suffered catastrophic losses before they could adjust their tactics. Near Bastogne, on December 21st, Schwerpanzerabteilung 501 lost 6 King Tigers to M36s from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion. The engagement occurred at ranges between 1900 and 2400 yards distances, at which German commanders believed they were safe. Near Elsenborn Ridge, on December 23rd, the 12th SS Panzer Division lost 9 Panthers and 2 King Tigers to a single platoon of M36s that engaged from concealed positions at 2100 yards, then displaced before German artillery could respond. The Germans were fighting blind. They knew they were losing tanks at unexpected ranges. They knew the losses were catastrophic, but they didn't understand why. Their intelligence still insisted American tank destroyers carried 76mm guns. The evidence, the penetrations, the ranges, the lethality didn't fit that model. So German analysts kept searching for alternative explanations. Improved ammunition, towed guns being deployed forward, even rumours of British 17-pounder equipped vehicles being transferred to American units. The truth that the Americans had deployed a 90mm gun and kept it secret for nearly 3 months was so unexpected that it lay outside the frame of possibilities German intelligence was considering. On December 27th, a German intelligence officer at 5th Panzer Army headquarters compiled a report titled Assessment of Abnormal American Anti-Tank Effectiveness. The report noted the unusually high German tank losses and attempted to explain them. The conclusion: American forces employing improved tactical doctrine, including enhanced camouflage discipline and coordinated fire from multiple positions. No evidence of new weapons systems. Current engagement protocols remain valid. The report was dated 11 days after the Ardennes offensive began. 11 days during which German tank battalions had been shredded by a weapon their commanders didn't know existed. It wasn't until January 4, 1945, that German intelligence finally, officially, identified the M36's 90mm gun. The confirmation came from multiple sources converging simultaneously. The technical analysis of the captured M36 from Saarlauten, which had finally been completed and distributed, reports from front-line units that had recovered intact 90mm ammunition from knocked-out M36s, and interrogations of captured American tank destroyer crews. The bulletin went out to all panzer units on January 6th. American M36 tank destroyer confirmed to be equipped with a 90mm gun. Penetration capability equivalent to German 88mm. KBUK 43. Effective range against all armor types, 2,500 meters. Vehicle profile similar to M10 Wolverine visual identification unreliable. Assume all American TDs potentially M36 equipped. Revised engagement protocols. Maintain standoff distance minimum 3,000 meters. Coordinate with artillery support before closing. Prioritize destruction of TDs before advancing. By the time this bulletin reached frontline units, the Battle of the Bulge was effectively over. German forces were retreating. Fuel shortages had paralyzed remaining armor units. American air superiority had returned with clearing weather. The strategic situation had shifted from German offensive to desperate German defense. The intelligence about the M36 was accurate and tactically valuable. It was also 3 months too late. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Between October 1st, 1944 and May 8th, 1945, M36 Jacksons destroyed approximately 354 German tanks. This figure comes from compiled records of American tank destroyer battalions, cross-referenced with German loss reports recovered from Wehrmacht archives after the war. The number is necessarily approximate. Battlefield reporting was imperfect. Multiple units sometimes claimed the same kill, and some German records were destroyed, but it represents the best available estimate from historical research. Of those 354 confirmed or probable kills, the breakdown by vehicle type is revealing: 187 Panthers, 79 Panzer IVs, 43 King Tigers, 28 Tiger Is, and 17 miscellaneous vehicles including Jagged Panthers and assault guns. The M36's effectiveness against King Tigers deserves particular attention. 43 King Tigers destroyed by M36 fire represents nearly 9% of total King Tiger production. Given that many King Tigers were lost to other causes, mechanical breakdown, air attack, abandonment due to fuel shortages, the M36 accounted for a significant portion of combat losses. German forces destroyed or disabled 102 M36s during the same period. Most of these losses occurred in close-range engagements, where German tanks and anti-tank guns could exploit the M36's relatively thin armor. The vehicle's frontal armor was only 50 mm thick, inadequate against German tank guns at ranges below 1,000 yards. This produces a kill-to-loss ratio of approximately 3.4 to 1 in favor of the M36, a respectable figure, though not exceptional compared to other tank destroyer types. The M18 Hellcat, for instance, achieved a kill-to-loss ratio of nearly 4 to 1, largely through superior speed and mobility. But raw kill ratios don't capture the M36's true impact. The weapon's strategic value lay not in how many tanks that it destroyed, but in how it changed German tactical behavior. After January of 1945, once German forces understood they were facing 90 mm guns, their doctrine shifted from aggressive armor maneuver to defensive caution. King Tigers, designed to dominate through firepower and armor, were increasingly used as static defensive strongpoints rather than mobile breakthrough weapons. This shift appears clearly in German after-action reports from the final months of the war. Panzer commanders repeatedly cite American long-range AT capability as a constraint on maneuver. Plans that would have previously called for aggressive armor thrusts instead specify infantry advance with armor in support, maintaining standoff distance. The psychological dimension was equally important. Interviews with captured German tank crews from early 1945 reveal a pervasive sense of vulnerability. One Panther commander, interrogated on February 8th, stated, "We never felt safe, even at 2,000 meters. Something out there could kill us, and we didn't know what it was or where it would fire from. It made every advance feel like driving into an ambush." This is the opposite of what German heavy tank doctrine intended. The King Tiger was supposed to create psychological dominance to force enemy units to retreat or surrender through the sheer impossibility of fighting back. Instead, by late 1944, King Tiger crews were experiencing what American tank destroyer crews had felt in Normandy, the demoralizing knowledge that the enemy could kill you before you even saw them. The Germans never recovered from this psychological reversal, and the M36 was a significant factor in creating it. But numbers and tactical analysis only tell part of the story. To understand the human dimension of this weapon's impact, we need to look at specific engagements, moments where the M36's capabilities intersected with individual decisions, training, and luck. February 14, 1945. The Rhineland. The town of Gotch, just inside the German border, is the objective. American and British forces are pushing east, grinding through the Siegfried Line fortifications, approaching the Rhine. German resistance is fierce, not because Berlin expects to win, but because every day of delay is one more day before the final collapse. Lieutenant Thomas Wellborn commands an M36 from the 771st Tank Destroyer Battalion. His crew has been in combat since Normandy. They've transitioned from M10S to M18S to M36S as the vehicles became available. Wellborn is 23 years old. His gunner, Sergeant Paul Kastner, is 20. The loader, Private First Class Eddie Morrison, is 19. At 0640, Wellborn's M36 is supporting an infantry advance across open farmland north of Gotch. Visibility is poor fog mixed with smoke from artillery. The infantry is pinned down by German machine gun fire from a tree line 800 yards ahead. Wellborn is scanning with his periscope when Morrison, looking through a vision port, says quietly, "Movement, 11 o'clock. Wellborn swings his periscope. They're emerging from the fog at approximately 2,000 yards is a King Tiger. The German tank is moving slowly, perhaps 10 miles per hour, advancing toward the pinned American infantry. It hasn't spotted the M36 yet. The fog is providing concealment in both directions. Wellborn has seconds to make a decision. His training says, engage heavy armor at maximum range. His tactical situation says, if the King Tiger reaches the infantry, it will massacre them. His experience says, the 90mm gun can kill at this range, but it's not certain fog degrades visibility. The target is moving, and a miss will reveal his position. Casper, target tank, 2,000 yards, 11 o'clock. Kastner traverses the turret. The electric motor hums. He finds the target through his telescopic sight, a dark shape in the fog, moving, left to right. Identified. Fire. The M36 rocks. The 90mm round exits at 2,800 feet per second. Time to target, 3.5 seconds. The shell hits the King Tiger's turret side. Penetration. The German tank lurches to a halt, smoke pouring from the turret hatches. Crew members bail out, visible as running figures in the fog. The American infantry, seeing the King Tiger disabled, resume their advance. They reach the tree line, clear the German positions. The attack succeeds. In his after-action report, Wellborn writes simply, "Destroyed one Tiger II at approx 2,000 yards. The enemy crew abandoned the vehicle." The report takes up 3 lines in the battalion's war diary, but think about what just happened. A 23-year-old lieutenant, operating a vehicle that looks like a dozen other American tank destroyers, engaged and destroyed the most powerful tank in the German arsenal at a range where that tank's crew believed they were invulnerable. The engagement took less than 10 seconds from target acquisition to kill. The German crew probably never saw what hit them. This was not exceptional. This was routine by February of 1945. The M36 had made it routine. The question worth asking is, what would have happened if the Germans had known about the 90mm gun from the beginning? If German intelligence had identified the M36 in October of 1944, if that captured vehicle from Saarlauten had been analysed immediately, if frontline units had been warned that American tank destroyers now carried guns capable of killing King Tigers at 2,500 yards, would it have changed the course of the Ardennes offensive? Tactically, yes, German armour doctrine would have adapted. King Tiger units would have maintained greater standoff distances, used terrain more cautiously, coordinated more closely with reconnaissance units to identify M36 positions before advancing. The psychological advantage, the M36 enjoyed the shock of unexpected lethality, would have been diminished. German tank losses in the Bulge would likely have been lower. Not dramatically lower, the fundamental strategic problems Germany faced by December of 1944 couldn't be solved by better tactics, but measurably lower. Perhaps 20 or 30 tanks that were destroyed by M36 fire would have survived if their commanders had understood the threat. But strategically, no meaningful change. The Ardennes offensive was doomed from conception. Germany lacked the fuel to sustain a deep penetration. German forces lacked air cover. American reserves, entire divisions that could be deployed in days, vastly outnumbered the German attacking force. Even if every German tank had survived, the offensive would still have failed once American reinforcements arrived and the weather cleared enough for Allied air power to operate. The M36 didn't win the Battle of the Bulge. American numerical superiority, logistics, and air power won the Battle of the Bulge. But the M36 made that victory faster and less costly. Every King Tiger destroyed at 2,000 yards was a King Tiger that didn't reach American infantry positions. Every Panther knocked out before it could close was a Panther that didn't kill Shermans or infantry fighting vehicles. The weapon's true value was in reducing American casualties. And in that metric, lives saved, the M36's impact is incalculable but real. By March of 1945, the war in Europe had entered its final phase. American and British forces were across the Rhine. Soviet armies were closing on Berlin from the east. German resistance was collapsing into fragmented defensive pockets. The M36 continued to see action, but the character of tank combat had changed. Large-scale armoured engagements became rare. German tanks, starved of fuel and ammunition, were increasingly used as immobile pillboxes. When they did move, it was a retreat. The final M36 kill of the European War occurred on May 7, 1945, one day before VE Day. An M36 from the 628th Tank Destroyer Battalion destroyed a Panzer IV near Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. The German tank had been abandoned by its crew, out of fuel. The M36 fired a single round to ensure it couldn't be recovered and reused. The shell penetrated the engine compartment. The tank burned. It was an unremarkable end to a remarkable weapons combat service. After the war ended, the M36 remained in American service for several years. Tank destroyer battalions were gradually disbanded as the army demobilized, but the vehicles themselves were retained. Some M36s saw service in the Korean War, though by then they were considered obsolete. The 90mm gun, so devastating in 1944, was now merely adequate against the Soviet-designed T-34, 85 seconds operated by North Korean forces. By 1955, most M36s had been retired from American service. But the vehicle's story didn't end there. Dozens of M36s were transferred to Allied nations under military aid programs. France received substantial numbers and deployed them in Algeria during the Algerian War. Yugoslavia operated M36s into the 1960s. South Korea maintained M36s in service until the 1980s, though they saw no combat after the Korean War armistice. The last known operational M36 was retired from the Republic of China Army Taiwan in 1994. That vehicle, serial number 40154637, is now preserved in a military museum in Taipei. Today, roughly 24 M36 Jacksons survive in museums and private collections worldwide. The example at Fort Moore, Georgia, the one mentioned earlier, is one of the most complete. It's maintained in running condition, occasionally demonstrated for public events. If you look closely at that particular M36, you'll notice something on the gun barrel. Painted in faded white, 5 small silhouettes, tank kills. This vehicle was credited with destroying 5 German tanks during the Rhineland campaign in early 1945. The crew's names are stenciled on the turret side. Lieutenant Robert Schaefer, Commander; Sergeant Michael Donovan, Gunner; CPL, James Mitchell, Loader; PFC, Carl Johnson, Driver. All 4 men survived the war. Schaefer returned to Iowa, where he ran a hardware store until his death in 2001. Donovan became an engineer, worked for Boeing, died in 2007. Mitchell taught high school history in Pennsylvania for 30 years. Johnson stayed in the Army, served in Korea and Vietnam, retired as a Master Sergeant in 1972. None of them ever wrote memoirs. None gave extensive interviews about their war service. They were, by all accounts, ordinary men who operated an extraordinary weapon during a brief window, when that weapon provided a decisive advantage. In 2008, a historian from the Army Heritage Center interviewed Mitchell, then 84 years old, for an oral history project. The interviewer asked him about the M36, whether he understood, at the time, how significant the 90mm gun was. Mitchell's response is preserved in the interview transcript. "We knew it was a good gun. We could hit things the old 76 couldn't touch. But did we think we were using some secret weapon? No, we just thought we had better equipment than we used to. You fire the gun, you see the target explode, you move to the next target. That's the job. We didn't know the Germans couldn't figure out what we were shooting at them. We just knew it worked." This is, perhaps, the most human dimension of the entire story. The crews operating the M36 had no idea they were exploiting an intelligence advantage. They were simply doing their jobs with the best available tools. The strategic implications, the German confusion, the intelligence failure, the operational impact, all of that existed at a level far and above their awareness. They fired, they hit, they survived. That was enough. The German experience of the M36 is harder to reconstruct, simply because fewer German sources survived. Wehrmacht records from late 1944 and early 1945 were spotty units were retreating, headquarters were being overrun, and in the final chaos of the war, record-keeping became sporadic at best. But we do have some accounts. Post-war interrogations of German tank commanders provide glimpses of how they perceived the threat. Hauptmann Werner Rahn, the Panzer Company commander who filed the urgent report after Geilenkirchen survived the war and was interviewed by American intelligence officers in May of 1945. The interview report, declassified in the 1970s, includes this exchange. Interviewer: "When did you first realize American tank destroyers had 90mm guns?" Rahn: "Not until January. We knew something had changed in November." The Rahn: "Penetrations, the ranges, but we thought it was ammunition. Better ammunition, maybe tungsten core. The intelligence briefings said the Americans still used 76mm. So that's what we believed." Interviewer: "How did this affect your tactics?" Rahn: "We became cautious. Too cautious, perhaps. Every American vehicle became a potential threat. We couldn't tell the difference between the M10 and the M36 from a distance. They looked the same. So we had to assume everyone was dangerous. That slowed us down. It made us hesitant. In armor warfare, hesitation is death. That last line captures the essential psychological impact. The King Tiger was designed to enable aggressive tactics through invulnerability, but the M36 made invulnerability impossible. And without invulnerability, the King Tiger's advantages, armor and firepower, were offset by its disadvantages: weight, fuel consumption, mechanical complexity. By early 1945, German tank commanders were approaching every engagement with defensive caution rather than offensive confidence. The M36 hadn't made German tanks obsolete. It had made German tank doctrine obsolete. There's a broader lesson here about intelligence and warfare that extends beyond the specific story of the M36. The German failure to identify the 90mm gun was not a failure of intelligence collection. German reconnaissance photographed M36s. German engineers examined, destroyed M36s. German analysts reviewed after-action reports describing long-range penetrations. The failure was cognitive. German intelligence had constructed a model of American anti-tank capabilities based on years of observation. That model was accurate until October of 1944, when it suddenly wasn't. But the model was so well established, so thoroughly integrated into German tactical doctrine, that when evidence appeared contradicting it, analysts found ways to fit that evidence into the existing framework rather than questioning the framework itself. This is called confirmation bias, and it's not unique to German intelligence. It's a fundamental feature of how human cognition processes information. We expect patterns to continue. We interpret ambiguous data in ways that confirm what we already believe. And we resist updating our models until the evidence becomes overwhelming. In civilian life, confirmation bias is merely problematic. In war, it's lethal. The American advantage with the M36 wasn't just technical, it was epistemological. The weapon looked enough like the M10 that German observers, expecting to see M10s, did see M10s. Their brains filled in the expected pattern. By the time they realized their expectations were wrong, they'd already lost dozens of tanks. This dynamic appears repeatedly throughout military history. In 1940, French intelligence dismissed reports of German armoured concentrations in the Ardennes because their doctrines said tanks couldn't operate in that terrain. In 1941, Soviet intelligence ignored warnings of German invasion because Stalin had decided war wasn't imminent. In 1973, Israeli intelligence missed the signs of Egyptian attack because they believed Egypt wasn't ready. The pattern is consistent. Intelligence failures happen not because information is unavailable, but because available information is interpreted through frameworks that are out of date. The M36 story is a relatively small example, a few hundred tanks destroyed, a tactical advantage that lasted a few months. But it illustrates the principle clearly. In war, the side that updates its understanding of reality faster has an enormous advantage. The side that clings to outdated models, even in the face of contradictory evidence, pays for that rigidity in blood. One final dimension of this story deserves attention: the industrial and logistical context that made the M36 possible. The 90mm gun wasn't a wonder weapon, it was conjured from thin air. It was an adaptation of existing technology anti-aircraft guns mounted on a modified tank chassis. The entire program, from concept to combat deployment, took roughly 18 months. This was fast by military procurement standards, but it wasn't revolutionary. What made the M36 significant wasn't the technology itself, it was the system that produced it. Between December of 1941 and August of 1945, American industry produced. The disparity is staggering. The United States outproduced Germany by a factor of 3-to-1 in tanks, 4-to-1 in aircraft. And this was while simultaneously supplying Britain, the Soviet Union, and dozens of other allies through Lend-Lease. The M36 existed within this context. American industry could afford to develop and deploy a new tank destroyer design in the middle of the war because the existing production capacity was so vast that adding another vehicle type barely strained the system. Germany couldn't do this. German tank production in late 1944 was constrained by shortages of raw materials, fuel, and skilled labor. The factories producing King Tigers were operating at partial capacity because they lacked steel alloys and machine tools. Developing an entirely new vehicle design would have required resources Germany didn't have. So while German engineers certainly could have designed a tank destroyer equivalent to the M36, they had the technical knowledge, the industrial base to mass produce. It didn't exist. This gets to the heart of why Germany lost World War II. It wasn't lost in any single battle. It wasn't lost because of inferior weapons. German tanks were, ton for ton, superior to Allied designs. It was lost because Germany was fighting enemies who could replace their losses faster than Germany could inflict them. Every King Tiger destroyed by an M36 was effectively irreplaceable. Germany produced 492 King Tigers total. Each loss was a permanent reduction in German combat power. Every M36 destroyed by German fire was replaced within weeks. The United States produced 2,324 M36s. Monthly production in early 1945 exceeded 150 vehicles. Losses could be absorbed without impacting operational capability. This is the brutal arithmetic of industrial warfare. Superior individual weapons don't matter if you can't produce enough of them. Tactical skill doesn't matter if you're outnumbered 5-to-1. Germany's panzer commanders were among the most experienced, skilled armoured warfare practitioners in history, and it didn't matter, because they were fighting with resources insufficient to the strategic situation. The M36 didn't win the war by itself, but it represents, in miniature, the dynamic that did win the war: American industrial and technological capacity, applied systematically to develop incremental advantages, fielded in sufficient numbers, create operational effects that German forces couldn't counter. In the final accounting, what can we say about the M36 Jackson and its 90mm gun? It was not the best tank destroyer of World War II. The German Jagd Panther had better armour and a more powerful gun. The British Archer was more compact and easier to transport. Even within American service, the M18 Hellcat arguably had better overall tactical performance. Its speed and mobility made it harder to kill, and its 76mm gun was sufficient for most targets. But the M36 had one critical advantage that the others lacked. It looked ordinary while being extraordinary. For roughly 12 weeks from early October to late December of 1944, the M36 operated in a sweet spot of battlefield intelligence. German forces encountered it frequently enough to suffer significant losses, but not frequently enough to trigger a systematic reassessment of American capabilities. Each engagement was interpreted as an anomaly rather than as data points in a pattern. And by the time German intelligence finally identified the weapon correctly, the strategic situation had shifted so dramatically that the tactical implications were largely moot. This 12-week window was enough. In that time, M36s destroyed an estimated 170 to 200 German tanks, including at least 20 King Tigers, at ranges where German commanders believed themselves safe. These losses contributed to the failure of the Ardennes offensive, not decisively but measurably. They accelerated the erosion of German armoured combat power at a moment when Germany had no capacity to replace those losses. More intangibly, the M36 contributed to a psychological shift in German armoured doctrine. After January of 1945, German armour operated with persistent awareness that American tank destroyers could kill them at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. This awareness bred caution, and reduced the effectiveness of armour as an offensive weapon. And without effective offensive armour, Germany's strategic options narrowed to pure defence, which, given the overwhelming Allied advantages in manpower and material, was simply a slower path to the same inevitable defeat. The crews who operated the M36 men like Early, Hensley, Wellborn, Kastner, Mitchell, and hundreds of others whose names appear only in unit rosters and casualty lists probably didn't think about any of this. They pointed their guns at enemy tanks. They fired. Sometimes they hit, sometimes they miss, sometimes the enemy fired back and they died, sometimes they survived. But the aggregate effect of their individual actions, multiplied across dozens of engagements, was a shift in the tactical balance of armoured warfare on the Western Front. The King Tiger, designed to dominate through invulnerability, lost that invulnerability, and a weapon that can be hurt is no longer terrifying, it's just a target. There's one last piece to this story. It's small, almost a footnote, but it captures something essential about how military history works. In 1953, the U.S. Army's Armour School at Fort Knox compiled an official history of American tank destroyer operations in World War II. The project involved reviewing thousands of after-action reports, interviewing surviving commanders, and analysing combat effectiveness data. One section of the report focused on the M36. The authors noted its high kill-to-loss ratio, its effectiveness against German heavy armour, and its operational success in the final campaigns of the war. But they also noted something curious. Despite the M36's technical advantages and combat success, crews generally preferred the M18 Hellcat when given a choice. The M18's superior speed and mobility were valued more highly than the M36's heavier gun. This suggests that in mobile warfare, the ability to avoid being hit outweighs the ability to penetrate heavier armour. This is probably correct from a pure survival standpoint. An M18 crew had a better chance of surviving the war than an M36 crew, simply because the M18 could run away from threats the M36 had to fight. But here's what the report doesn't mention. The M36 crews didn't have the luxury of choosing their weapon. They were issued the M36 and told to engage heavy armour at maximum range. They did the job they were assigned, with the tools they were given, under conditions they didn't control, and in doing that job, they helped win a war. That's not heroic in the traditional sense. There were no dramatic last stands, no impossible odds overcome through sheer willpower. It was simply competent professionals using effective equipment to accomplish specific tactical objectives. But sometimes that's what war comes down to. Not grand gestures or decisive moments, but the accumulated weight of thousands of small actions, each performed adequately, until the enemy's capacity to resist finally collapses. The M36 Jackson, with its 90mm gun that the Germans never saw coming, represents that kind of victory. Unglamorous, incremental, and utterly decisive. December 19th, 1944. The morning fog over Street Vith. Oberleutnant Friedrich Baer never knew what killed him. The armor-piercing round struck his King Tiger's turret at a range he'd been taught was safe. The last thought that passed through his mind in the fraction of a second between impact and detonation was probably confusion. Something was wrong. The Americans weren't supposed to have weapons that could do this. But they did. And by the time German intelligence figured that out, Baer was 3 weeks dead, and Germany's last offensive in the West had failed, and the war was moving inexorably toward its conclusion. 2,700 yards away, Staff Sergeant Robert Early lowered his periscope, ordered his driver to back out of the firing position, and move to the next planned location. There was more work to do, more targets to engage. The war wasn't over. He didn't know he'd just participated in an intelligence coup that would haunt German armoured doctrine for the rest of the war. He just knew his gun worked, his crew was competent, and the enemy was dying. Sometimes that's all a soldier needs to know. The larger implications, the strategic effects, the intelligence failures, the industrial dynamics, the psychological impacts, those are for historians to analyse decades later. In the moment, there's only the immediate, the target in your sight, the trigger under your finger, the split second between decision and consequence. The M36 gave American tank destroyer crews the tools to make those split-second decisions count. It gave them a gun that could reach across the battlefield and kill the most powerful tanks Germany could field. It gave them, for a brief but critical period, an advantage their enemy didn't understand and couldn't counter. That advantage was measured in hundreds of destroyed tanks, in thousands of lives saved, in days and weeks shaved off the war's brutal timeline. It wasn't decisive by itself, no single weapon ever is, but it mattered. And sometimes, in war, matter is enough. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.